Hello, class. My name is Jacob Walters, and today I've decided to change things up a little bit. So I've decided to change my area of research. I've spent a great deal of time studying premillennial dispensationalism and in the context of American fundamental evangelical Christianity. But to tell you the truth, I'm tired of it. And so I have decided to begin a new phase of research that will focus on some aspect of the history of counterinsurgency and counterterrorism operations conducted by the United States military since World War II. I will be focusing on some aspect of how conventional forces have been retasked and rearranged in order to adapt to the unique style of fighting and the unique style of warfare that insurgencies demand. In framing my research question, it will be important for me to communicate the fact that World War II had a profound effect on how the U.S. Armed Forces have been designed and organized over the last 80 or so years. The military, and the land forces in particular, have been focused on fighting the Russians in Europe in what we call high-intensity warfare. This means essentially that large numbers of soldiers and equipment engaged in large-scale battles similar to those fought in World War II in Korea. All of this began to change when the United States became involved in the war in Vietnam, which was in many ways a counterinsurgency, it was an insurgency and therefore forced us to fight a counterinsurgency. It involved irregular forces operating amongst the civilian population. It involved the struggle for territory, but also of the opinions, the beliefs, and the support of that civilian population. So the first book that I found for today's topic in the online scholarship library, the Oxford Scholarship Online Library, is called The British Way in Counterinsurgency, 1945 to 1967. This book is useful to this type of research because it provides a history of British counterinsurgency operations. And even though it focuses on Great Britain, it discusses the development of modern counterinsurgency techniques, many of which were adopted by the United States. Great Britain, after all, was fighting insurgencies long before anybody in the United States even thought about it. This was particularly due to their colonial territories like India, South Africa in the early 20th century, and then Ireland, Palestine, and Malay in the latter 20th century. According to David French, the author of this particular work, the British were pioneers of the concept of the battle for hearts and minds, the idea that winning the trust and support of the local population is often more important than the destruction of the insurgents themselves. This type of operation is effective because counterinsurgencies are intelligence-driven, and the local population is able to provide intelligence and information that outsiders simply never will have access to. And they're also able to obtain insights, cultural insights, social insights that outsiders just don't know anything about. And it would, honestly, it would take them decades to learn these things. Any study of American counterinsurgency operations will necessarily need to examine the British experience. So on to the second book, which is called War and Society in Afghanistan, from the Mughals to the Americans, 1500 to 2013. It gives a historical overview of the Afghan people and their unique position that has placed them at the heart of some of the most famous modern counterinsurgency operations, from the Soviet invasion to the Osama bin Laden raid. This book also includes an analysis of Afghanistan's long history as a graveyard of empires, from Rome to Alexander the Great to the Mongols, and then the British, and now the Americans. Many nations have tried, and all have failed to subdue the Afghan people. And this is in great part to the unique style of insurgent warfare that they employ in Afghanistan. Afghanistan is a rural, nomadic people who, who understand their landscape, and they have a very intricate political system that outsiders find it very hard to penetrate, which makes counterinsurgency very difficult in this particular area. However, understanding Afghan military history and culture is important when looking at American counterinsurgency because of the long history that the nation has in that area. With the exception of 10 or so years fighting counterinsurgency in Iraq, and fighting, the pseudo-insurgency that we had in Vietnam, Afghanistan has been the crucible for the development of American counterinsurgency tactics, techniques, and strategies. The chapter in this particular book on U.S. and NATO operations is most significant because it gives many examples of how the nation's conventional forces learned to adapt to a war that was anything but the fast-paced, high-intensity conflict that they had been training for during the 80s and 90s. So I imagine that both of these books will find their way into my research as it progresses, and specifically in helping me to formulate the right questions and understand the context a little more thoroughly. So thanks for listening, and I hope you guys have a great evening.